Welcome to Retail Crime Uncovered, the go-to podcast for anything and everything retail crime related. I'm your host, Professor Emmeline Taylor. Did you know that 82% of statistics are made up on the spot? I'll just let that sink in a moment. But it's just a little joke to highlight that we shouldn't always take statistics and data at face value. And some of the conversations I have at times, people quite readily can reel off a range of statistics around retail crime, and inevitably it's going up at exponential rates. But when you try and dig a little bit deeper into some of these numbers, you quickly meet some difficulties around their reliability, credibility. Even the source of them sometimes is very difficult to track down. I've always quite liked the adage it's attributed to Benjamin Disraeli. There are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think this is really revealing to really begin thinking about what data sources are we using. Is that data reliable? Is it actionable? What is it telling us about the types of retail crime, not just whether it's going up and down? I've recently been delivering several talks to international audiences, and as a researcher, one of the first things I do is my homework. I try and understand what's happening in different regions, try and benchmark it to other geographical locations to get a sense of what's happening in different places. But that's not always quite as easy as it sounds. I've heard so much in recent times that we're experiencing a crime wave, a tsunami of crime even. How can we then simultaneously be experiencing a severe data drought? I'm probably going to labour this metaphor somewhat throughout this episode. I really want to begin to understand some of the data, police recorded crime, official statistics, and then the plethora of industry surveys that we have being produced internationally. Lots of different surveys, all trying to place estimates, dollar figures, pound figures, and the number of incidents. But we've got a real issue in particular around chronic underreporting of theft in particular, but also with violence and abuse. And this makes measuring changes in the prevalence of crime very difficult. So today's episode is going to be slightly different. Apologies, you'll just hear my voice as I try and get to grips with some of these different data sources, and then hopefully reach some conclusions about where we should be drawing our data from, what its uses and its limitations are, so that we can confidently apply it as and when it's relevant, and be very cautious when perhaps there's suggestions that it's not as credible as perhaps we might like. But of course, data has multiple uses and purposes, and I think it's really important to recognise that as well. We can all admire the problem, and so industry surveys or other reports that begin to present actionable data, I think, is the end goal that we really need to reach. We need visibility on levels of crime, of course, and frequencies. Is it going up? Is it going down? Can we benchmark against other regions? But we also need to understand the qualitative aspects. So in what ways is modus operandi shifting? What different tactics are offenders using? What types of solutions are effective? What guarding strategies should be put in place? All of these decisions really need to be underscored by robust data sources, not just numbers, but underlying trends and shifts in behaviour. It also plays an important role in underpinning legislative changes, lobbying government to introduce different or harsher or better, more effective penalties, and to really illuminate where there is an issue and that the industry needs to respond. So we'll really begin to look at some of these benefits, limitations, and what the next step should be in terms of trying to gain credible data sources. The first thing we should be absolutely clear on is that police recorded crime is not a reliable indicator of crime rates. So much so that in the UK in 2014, it was decided that police recorded crime would no longer be categorised as official statistics. There were huge concerns over the quality, the consistency of crime recording practices. And so when police recorded crime was assessed against a code of practice for statistics, it was found not to meet the required standard for designation as national statistics. So that's really important to recognise. So many crimes go unreported, or for one reason or another, they don't make it into the system. The gap between the number of crimes that occur and those that we know about is referred to as the dark figure of crime. And the dark figure of crime is higher for different crime types. So, for example, murder, homicide, typically has a very low dark figure. Understandably, most murders do be discovered and reported, and the police would always then take action in that circumstance. And similarly, crimes where there's an incentive for victims to report, such as they have insurance, are also relatively high. So, for example, as home insurance started to become much more mainstream in the 1970s, it coincided with a quite dramatic increase in reports of burglary to the police. It was fairly clear that victims now had a reason to report and a requirement to get a crime reference number in order to make a claim against their contents insurance. But obviously that societal trend was nothing to do with the actual prevalence of offences that were taking place. As a criminologist, when I'm evaluating a new crime-related initiative, I'm often looking for the police recorded crime rate to actually go up as an indicator of positive progress. Now, this seems counterintuitive, and often politicians, policymakers, and the public fundamentally misunderstand why this is usually a good thing. An increase in reported crime doesn't usually mean there's actually been an increase, but that more people, members of the public, feel empowered, supported, or motivated to report the crime that they have experienced or witnessed because they feel that something will be done. And that's always a positive thing. They might think there's a consequence for the perpetrator, or that they have confidence in the police and the broader criminal justice system to do something about it. So in my view, the smaller the dark figure, the better. But sometimes that can be a bit of a hard sell for politicians who don't want to see crime rates go up, even though we know they're not official or of a true reflection of crime that's out there. They simply don't want this to happen on their watch because of the complexity of explaining that to a broader public. So take England and Wales, for example. Police recorded crime last year for retail theft was around 340,000 incidents. And then it increased this year. The latest figures that have come out is 420,000 incidents of theft over the entire year. Now, you don't need to be a statistician to know that this is an extremely conservative estimate or level of reporting. I think any business would tolerate that level of theft once it's been averaged out across the number of business premises. The Co-op, for example, in the UK, there are grocers, stated from its own data that they were experiencing 1,000 incidents a day. So that one business alone was close to the police recorded crime for every business that year. Now, there's over 300,000 retail businesses in the UK, so this would equate roughly to each premises reporting less than 1.5 incidents a year. I mean, that's very low. Now, of course, crime and theft isn't distributed evenly. There will be some retail premises that very rarely experience theft. They might be in small communities where people know each other, high levels of guardianship. That means that people would not steal from that particular location. There might be other factors at play, of course, as well. And we know that crime is heavily concentrated within densely populated metropolitan locations with high footfall, transient populations. We know that they'll always experience higher levels of crime. And so already averaging out the number of incidents nationally and temporarily as well, across time as well as space, begins to restrict some of our understanding of the data. We lose that granularity immediately. Now, roughly over the same period of time, the British Retail Consortium, the BRC, estimated that there were nearly 17 million incidents of theft across the UK. Now, let's take that at face value for now, although we'll come back to surveys and some of the issues around methodology later. That means that just 2.5% of thefts were reported to the police. So we can begin to see why they are not recognised as official statistics. It also gives us a dark figure of over 16 million incidents of theft that we don't know a huge amount about. Who were the perpetrators? Are they working solo, in groups? Where did the incident happen? Why did it happen? What was the motivation? What was the value of losses? Was violence or verbal abuse involved? If we don't have the data, we simply cannot begin to understand the trends of what is happening. And going back to previous episodes, it really puts the power in the hands of the criminals because they're able to go under the radar. People are struggling to join the dots, particularly on organised or travelling groups of offenders who are treating this essentially as a illicit business. And given that chronic level of underreporting, is it any wonder that some commentators, myself included, suggest that theft, retail crime, has largely been decriminalised in some locations? Now, I draw upon data from the UK primarily because that's where I'm based. It's the data that I have at my fingertips. I read it and hear it multiple times every week, so I'm hugely more familiar with it than some other sources. But it's not just in the UK that we have these issues around data. This is replicated internationally. In Australia, the National Retail Association, the NRA, estimates that less than 20% of retail crimes are reported to the police, so fewer than 1 in 5. Again, I think that's probably quite an optimistic figure. But overall, to go back to my water-based metaphor, I promise you I would, it seems to me that we're often having to base risk mitigation strategies on what we can see in the rock pools, whilst ignoring the entire ocean. So let's now turn to exploring some of the industry surveys that are conducted. And there's many of these internationally, some that are produced annually, several of which have been postponed over COVID. But those annual ones or periodic ones enable benchmarking over time. Others appear to be a little bit more ad hoc and produce perhaps when there's a particular issue that needs investigating. But one of the things that I will say about these surveys is that, frustratingly, they ask slightly different questions in different ways, which means that the data cannot be directly compared across different surveys. They might use different definitions as well. ORC is a case in point. We still don't have an industry universal definition for what ORC actually means. So again, we're comparing apples and pears sometimes when we're trying to look at these different data sources. They also cover different time periods. And now some of this is understandable. We have different financial years in different countries. And so several surveys use the financial year. Others might use the calendar year going from January to December. But it means that seasonality of crime isn't always being picked up. And again, we're looking at different time periods. So again, another little bugbear for me when we try and look across all of these data sources to draw comparisons. In April last year, in 2023, the National Retail Federation, the NRF, published a report about organised retail crime. They produced it in conjunction with a private security firm, K2 Integrity. In that report, they claimed nearly half of the estimated $94.5 billion that retailers said they lost to shrink in 2021 was attributable to organised retail crime. There was then some scrutiny over this figure and an investigation from Retail Dive, and the NRF ultimately retracted their claim at the end of November last year, it was suggested that the analysis was incorrect and the data was essentially flawed. Now, this caused various sort of ripples, I think, throughout the industry, and I think really began to set in motion a questioning of some of these figures. And the retraction underscores just how difficult it is for the industry to accurately measure the impact and source of inventory losses. And I sympathise with the NRF and their researchers for the difficulties that they encountered and the loss of credibility if the methodology cannot stand up to scrutiny. And we'll revisit this in a moment as well in terms of some of the backlash against the claims that the industry has been making in terms of the levels of crime and particularly violent crime that's being experienced. I'm now going to talk a little bit about a government-led industry survey. So in the UK, the Home Office run the Commercial Victimisation Survey, the CVS, and it aims to interview by phone 4,000 randomly chosen business premises to gain information about their experiences of crime. Now, one thing to flag is surveys are notorious for low response rates, and this is an issue that besets every single survey, but I think particularly when you're trying to engage with industry that often don't want to share their data, or worse still, might not have the data in a format ready to share or easily translated to answer some of the questions that the survey might be trying to elicit. So in terms of low responses, the latest commercial victimisation survey achieved roughly half of its desired sample. So just over 2,000 interviews were completed. Now, some of that is probably due to the methods that is being utilised. Telephone interviews were probably quite a good way to reach business premises pre-COVID. But we've had so many shifts in the way that businesses operate now that trying to contact somebody and the right person by telephone is probably not going to elicit the response that is desired. Anyway, that low sample has then meant that some of the data that they've produced, they can't cut and slice in ways that would provide us with detailed information. There just isn't enough numbers to be able to process it in a useful way. The margins of error around the estimates would be too large to draw conclusions about trends, particularly when comparing to previous years. Another thing with the commercial victimisation survey is that they changed the methodology in quite a fundamental way back in 2019. And the decision was taken that rather than ask how many crimes, how many thefts, how many incidents of criminal damage, how many incidents of violence a retail premises has experienced, they were going to look at frequency. So the question changes to how many times have you experienced a theft? And it could be only once, several times a year, roughly once a month, roughly once a week, roughly once a day, roughly several times a day. Now, I actually sit on the Home Office expert panel for the Commercial Victimisation Survey, and this was discussed at length, and there is benefits to perhaps changing the wording, but there's certainly pitfalls as well. And I hold my hands up, be completely transparent. I opposed the move largely when it was being tabled, partly because this data is, it's my bread and butter. It's the type of things that I need to draw upon and be able to cite. But talking about businesses that, they experience a crime roughly once a month isn't really a very compelling way to engage policymakers, the media, the public, to try and generate shared concern over shifts in crime. So for me, that was quite difficult. And I think perhaps that has been reflected. We don't see academics using that particular survey particularly often, whereas where we have the number of incidents or value, whether that's pounds, dollars, euros, etc., it is immediately relatable to the general public who can think, oh, that's a high number, or That's a large sum of money. But saying several times a month, it's very difficult to gauge, well, is that typical? Is that bad? Should we be worried about that? It lacks that immediacy in terms of the message that's being told. I've been told that the CVS will change. Potentially, it'll be revisited again next year. It's certainly not a cheap exercise to try and interview 4,000 retail premises. So I think it'd be really good to see if it can be revitalised into perhaps a more meaningful and actionable data set. I'd really like to see some qualitative data being brought into that one as well, because it looks at various different sectors. It'd be great to understand the way that people are targeting different types of retail premises, using different MOs, stealing different products, and overall just a little bit more detail about what is happening. Now, I've spoken a little bit about the low response rates for industry surveys, and I think this is really important to understand because it essentially can skew the data. It can give us an unrepresentative view of what's happening. Now, there's many surveys that I could move to look at next, but I'm going to look at the British Retail Consortium's annual crime report because it's very recently came out. It made lots of headlines across the UK and beyond. Now, the British Retail Consortium is not whole of industry. It's a members organisation and they have about 200 members. And they state that their latest survey results are based on a sample from retailers representing over 1.1 million employees. Now, that sounds hugely impressive. Wow, you must have overcome some of the sampling issues that usually besets other surveys of this type. But I went on the British Retail Consortium's webpage and I just randomly selected from their 200 members and had a little look at how many employees each of them had. Now, I managed to reach 1.1 million employees after just 10 businesses were looked at. So essentially this claim that their sample represents retailers of 1.1 million employees could be based on just 10 businesses responding to their survey. Now, I'm not suggesting that that is the case, but that could be the case. And there's very little information in the methodology to suggest otherwise. Now, that could present a very skewed picture. And one might argue that those businesses that are motivated to respond to these surveys are experiencing a disproportionately high level of crime. And so they want to have their figures represented in the survey. Now, I've said previously, in the UK, there's over 300,000 retail businesses. So if we've got just 10, 15 people responding to that survey, that does present an issue with skewed data. And I think one thing that anyone running a survey needs to do is be transparent about their methodology and highlight if there's limitations. It's well recognised that, there will be, but it just enables people to put the correct caveats around the data and not take action on something that might not be as credible as one might hope. Now, the Home Office is really good at that. So, a great example would be to look at their technical reports to see how they go through the methodology, the decisions that have been made over the years, why things have changed, what the outcome of that was. And they tell you, this means that you can't compare this year with 3 years ago, and completely open and transparent about it. But of course, they do also have larger resources, I think, than some industry bodies. But what is good about some of these surveys is that, okay, we might have a few issues with the numbers. They might feel like a few extra zeros have been added or taken off at times. It's not an exact science. But what they're really good at, though, is generating debate. And, the BRC has been in the media a huge amount over the last year, and their figures are cited so often compared to the Home Office CVS. So, for example, the latest survey suggested just over 1,300 violent or abusive incidents a day, and that was up from 870 in their last survey. So they're good at grabbing the headlines, they're good at providing a benchmark or easily citable figures. in a way that we know the police data is wildly off the mark. But let's just go back to that issue around credibility, if the methodology cannot be scrutinised or if we think that it might be an unrepresentative sample. Now, I mentioned earlier that in some locations, this has led to a bit of a backlash against the industry, with claims that some businesses are using the crime epidemic as a bandwagon to mask some unfavourable and unpopular decisions about permanently shuttering stores, particularly in deprived or disadvantaged locations, or drawing upon crime figures as a useful narrative to explain losses that might otherwise have been attributed to factors such as poorly performing assortments in store, a reduction in the workforce, or difficulties with recruitment and retention. Over the last couple of years, it's become more common for retailers to blame smaller than expected profits on retail theft, and particularly organised retail crime. In May last year, we saw Target, Dollar Tree, Home Depot, TJ Maxx, Foot Locker, all of these major household names were all citing shrink, and retail theft in particular, as a key reason for lower profits or hits to their gross margins. Some major businesses have even backpedaled a little bit. So we heard from Walgreens' chief financial officer, who said that perhaps the company's concerns over theft may have been overblown. Maybe we cried too much last year, is what he said on a call with investors. So perhaps some of this noise around shrink has spooked investors, and now there's a certain degree of backlash and wanting to step away from the crime epidemic. It's a really interesting time to see what's going to happen in this respect. But some of these surveys have absolutely underscored really fantastic moves in the right direction. We're seeing legislative change being enacted in various locations. We're seeing the public beginning to rally around businesses and realise that they're really key places within their community and that they need to be supported. So just to wrap up, I've got 6 key takeaways from understanding police recorded crime, data, industry surveys, and how to go about benchmarking data from different regions and different time periods. Number 1, police recorded crime should not be used as an indicator of the prevalence, value, etc. of retail crime. It is wildly inaccurate. Number 2, we need better reporting. We need to incentivise staff, or at least better facilitate their reporting to the police. That's the only way that we can gain true visibility. One company gives staff hours back for reporting crime, and the more minutes they get for the more complex reports that they do. In episode 5 of Retail Crime Uncovered, I spoke to employees on the shop floor, and one store manager remarked to me, "I'm not a store manager, I'm a crime manager." And this really resonated with me. He spent hours every day dealing and responding to incidents of crime. And where that's the case, staff need to be better supported, and it needs to be acknowledged that their workloads must be adjusted to help them manage to protect the business. Thirdly, I think it's probably come out quite strongly in this episode, I hope so at least, we need to treat surveys with caution. There's multiple caveats. Have a look at the methodologies and have a think about how that data can be interpreted. I'd like to see the industry pool resources rather than have a series of small ad hoc surveys with low response rates that are members only. Why not invest in an industry survey that has shared definitions, allows for benchmarking over the years across verticals and across regions and through time? Surely that should be the end game. Now, if we can't get to that point, please let's just standardise the wording of questions so that we can have that comparability. Fifthly, we need actionable data and recommendations. Far too often, these surveys and other types of reports just admire the problem. They just describe it. Well, how is that actionable? What do we need to do? What is your call for action? What do we need to do and change? I'd really like to see much more focus on recommendations and meaningful change. Now, 6, we've talked a lot about numbers. Of course, data is typically numerical. But what about qualitative data? It's so often missing. The numbers can give us some insights, but it's really only one half of the story. So we need more qualitative studies to understand the how, why, and the what. This would illuminate shifts in MO and different tactics being used by offenders, and hopefully get the industry ahead of the game instead of always being on the back foot. This type of information can inform training as well as risk mitigation strategies. And qualitative data allows us to humanise the figures. It's not always the most compelling to inform policymakers about figures that are going up or down or plateauing, particularly when they're non-experts. It's sometimes very difficult for them to grasp what that actually means. But how about telling them about Barbara, a mother of 3 children who was violently assaulted by a shoplifter and is now too scared to go to work? It's far more compelling and begins to show the reality of some of these more hostile environments. So that's my thoughts of the day and why it's so challenging to actually get accurate data on retail crime. I would love to hear from you if there's a particular survey that you think has nailed it, if there's a particular data source that you frequently draw upon, or just your comments around what the current state of play is and how we might be able to get a more consistent and reliable approach to understanding the crime data.